Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a really fascinating stack of source material on our hands today. We're diving into something that, well, like so many things in nature, or even in business, seems to follow these surprisingly predictable patterns. Think about how a company starts and grows, or even just human life stages. There are these phases, right?
That's exactly right. And our sources today take that idea, this concept of developmental phases, and apply it specifically to church planting. They really make the point that these initiatives, much like other organisms or institutions, they tend to progress through phases that are, well, reasonably predictable is the term they use.
Predictable, huh? So it's not just random chance, but something you can sort of anticipate.
Exactly. The source material really emphasizes that while these phases are more, fluid than strictly separate steps, understanding the general flow is absolutely key. It helps you see the changing needs, the potential challenges you'll likely face, and also the opportunities that pop up at different points. And ignoring those shifts, the sources definitely warn, can lead to real difficulties or, just getting stuck.
Okay, so our mission here in this deep dive is basically to pull out the core insights from this material. We want to figure out what these phases actually are, what they look like, and maybe most importantly, see what that tells us about how you plan and lead something like this.
Yeah, and it might sound like a very specific topic, church planting, but honestly, stick with us. Because the principles we're going to uncover here about growth, about leadership needing to adapt, equipping others, building from multiplication, they have surprising echoes in so many other areas. Leadership, organizations, you name it.
What's fascinating, like right off the bat, is the source tells us there isn't just one single way everyone agrees to think about this. It sounds like different models have been proposed over time to describe this journey.
Yes, exactly. It walks us through a few of them.
Yeah.
For instance, there's the Pauline cycle.
Hmm.
This one looks at the Apostle Paul's missionary work, in the book of Acts. It focuses more on the tasks the planter does, like contacting people, sharing the gospel, seeing conversions, forming a congregation, then moving on.
Okay, so very centered on the missionary or the planter themselves, their actions. The source seems to suggest that's, well, it's great for that initial pioneer work, but maybe less helpful for understanding the internal growth, the development of the church itself, or how it reproduces. Is that fair?
That's precisely the critique offered, yeah. Useful for the planter's itinerary, maybe less so for the actual organism they leave behind. Then there's a really common approach, using a biological analogy. They call it the church planting life cycle.
Ah, right. The one that sounds like, well, a life cycle. Conception, prenatal, birth, growth, reproduction, that kind of thing.
Exactly that. It's intuitive, pretty easy to grasp. And the source notes this model often puts a lot of emphasis on the planning, the lead up to the birth. And that birth is frequently defined as, the first public worship service.
And that definition of birth, just the first service, sounds like it might have some limitations, according to the source.
It does, yeah. Defining birth just by that first public service, well, it isn't always relevant or even helpful. Think about, say, a movement of simple house churches where a big public service isn't the main thing, or just different cultural contexts where that idea is kind of foreign. Plus, the source gently suggests it's not necessarily the most biblical definition of when a church actually starts. A gathering of believers can exist before that big public moment.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So are there other models the source gets into?
Yep. It also brings up Tom Steffen's church planter phase-out model. Now, this one is quite distinct because its whole core idea is built around the planter intentionally working themselves out of a job, like right from the start, by equipping local believers to take over everything, leadership, ministry, the works.
Working yourself out of a job, that's a pretty counterintuitive goal for most leaders.
Yeah.
How does that phase out actually look in his model?
Well, Steffen maps out how the planter's role changes progressively. They start out as a learner, really understanding the context, then they become an evangelist, then a teacher, then they shift to being like a resident advisor, then an itinerant or visiting advisor, and finally they become basically an absent advisor. They've handed it all over.
I really like that concept. Baking in that self-sufficiency and local ownership from day one. And the source points out that this phase-out idea, it's powerful, right? And applicable beyond just the tribal context where Steffen first developed it.
It really is. And interestingly, the main developmental model proposed in this source actually builds pretty significantly on that phase-out idea. It also incorporates elements of planning and structure from some other models. But its specific focus, its lens, is squarely on church reproduction and multiplication, particularly in pioneer, cross-cultural settings.
Okay, so this is less about just planting one church and much more about sparking a whole movement that multiplies itself.
Precisely. That's the goal. It emphasizes being lay-driven, so less dependent on, professional vocational pastors in the traditional sense. Highly adaptable, working well with various church forms like house churches, and designed to function even when resources are pretty limited. The ultimate aim isn't just a church plant, it's a multiplying movement, which the source aligns with what it calls an apostolic approach.
Okay, that context is super helpful. So let's really unpack the 5 phases of this specific model, the one that the source details. What's the very first step on this multiplication journey?
Phase 1, preparing. This is all about anticipation, laying that critical groundwork. It's really about making sure you get the right people together with the right understanding, the right resources before you even begin the more public work.
And the source actually breaks this foundational phase down into 2 key subphases, doesn't it? What's the first one?
That's right. The first is targeting and commissioning. This is where you define the vision. Like, what kind of church plant or movement are we actually aiming for? Where is it going to be? And who exactly are the ministry-focused people, the group you're trying to reach? It involves selecting the leader or lead couple, recruiting that initial team, and, really importantly, securing prayer and financial support for the whole thing. In this subphase, the source says the primary role of the church planters is team builders.
Right. Building that core group, the vision, the support system, makes sense. And the second subphase within preparing.
That's understanding and strategizing. So once you have the team, you engage in really careful, prayerful planning. But it has to be based on the context. This means learning the language and culture if that's needed, doing deep research into the context, the demographics, social landscape, religious beliefs. It's about figuring out your evangelistic strategy, the overall approach. You're building relationships in the target area, strengthening the team internally, getting any training you need.
Okay. So the role shifts here from team builders to learners. And the source has a strong caution here, doesn't it? Something about even experienced planters needing to be careful not to assume they know enough because every cultural context is brand new.
Absolutely. Humility and a real commitment to deep learning are just paramount. You can't skip this. And the source stresses something else here, the importance of developing genuine love for the focus people during this phase. It sees that as foundational.
Okay, so you prepared, you've learned, you've got your strategy, your team. That leads us into phase 2, launching. This sounds like where things really start happening.
It really is. It's the exciting liftoff, as they call it. This phase primarily involves evangelizing and discipling. It's about developing those initial relationships you forged in phase 1 into real opportunities for sharing your faith. Seeing the first new believers come to faith, baptizing them, and starting to disciple them, usually in small, very reproducible groups.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, connecting back to that multiplication goal. The source makes a really crucial point about what happens right from the start in this phase, doesn't it?
Yes, this is absolutely key to their model. Right from the very beginning, those first new believers, they're trained to minister. And they're immediately mobilized to share their faith with others and disciple them. So the methods you use, they have to be simple, easily imitated, reproducible by local people with maybe limited resources or education. Planters actually share leadership even at this basic level, maybe training the very first small group leaders almost immediately.
Wow, so you're not waiting for them to be mature or anything? You're equipping for mission from day one. That feels pretty countercultural to some traditional ways of doing things, doesn't it?
It fundamentally shifts the focus, yeah.
Yeah.
It's about immediate multiplication potential. The source notes that in pioneer settings where maybe there are very few local believers on the initial team, the planters are initially the motor, they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting. But as soon as local believers emerge and start being equipped, the planter's role has to rapidly shift. They become the model for reproducible ministry, showing how it's done so others can easily copy it.
Got it. Motor to model during launching. Okay, so after that initial surge, seeing the first fruits, you move to phase 3, establishing.
Yes. This is where those first believers start being formed into something more like a functioning congregation. The focus here is on congregating and maturing. Small groups might begin combining for larger gatherings, maybe occasional public worship, perhaps starting infrequently and then moving towards weekly services as they grow.
And the source makes a really firm statement about what needs to happen for ministry to actually progress in this phase, like a prerequisite.
It does. It says ministry only advances as local leaders show ownership and ability. You just can't push it faster than the local believers are ready and equipped to carry it. And while some structure begins to form, maybe thinking about basic budgets, meeting places the source gives another strong warning here too. Don't let buildings and budgets become the central focus. That can so easily distract from the actual mission. A preliminary local leadership team starts to form during this time.
And the planter's role? Does it change again? Are they the main pastor now that there's a congregation forming?
No, absolutely not, according to this model. In fact, they have to actively resist becoming the primary pastoral leader. That's crucial. Their focus shifts dramatically again towards equipping those emerging local leaders. The planter roles here are now mobilizer and mentor. Their work becomes increasingly behind the scenes, equipping, counseling, encouraging the people who are stepping into the visible leadership roles.
And the source calls this establishing phase the most critical phase of all. Why such emphasis on this one?
Because, the source argues, this phase sets the fundamental DNA, the patterns, the culture for the future of the church. The precedents you establish here for leadership, for equipping, for how ministry is done, they're incredibly difficult to change later on. If equipping isn't prioritized right here, the church will likely really struggle to reproduce effectively down the road.
Okay, that makes so much sense. You're basically building the operating system, the culture, during this phase.
Yeah.
So from establishing, we move into phase 4, structuring.
Right. This phase often brings a sense of satisfaction, The hard work of those earlier phases starts to pay off in a more visible, organized way. It's about providing necessary structure to support the work of expanding and empowering. Whether you've got a movement of house churches or a more traditional church structure, organization takes a more formal shape here. Things like formally identifying and calling leaders, maybe legal incorporation if that's needed in the context, initiating new ministries to meet the growing needs of the body and the community.
And this is where local believers are really fully empowered.
Yes, increasingly empowered for full responsibility and autonomy. That's the goal. Integrating new people effectively, ensuring there's ongoing training, mobilizing everyone for ministry becomes essential. The source also highlights that teaching stewardship is vital during this phase. As ministry grows, it needs resources, and those should come from within. Structures also need to evolve beyond those simple family-like bonds of the early days.
And there's another warning here about external support, isn't there? About money from outside.
A crucial one, yes. Outside subsidies, financial support from the planting agency or parent church must be systematically reduced. The goal is to avoid creating dependency. You want a self-sustaining, locally led entity. Apostolic planters in this model are actively preparing for their full withdrawal at this point. The main role of the mission team is now explicitly multipliers. They're focused on equipping those local leaders to become equippers of others. You're really looking ahead, identifying and preparing the next generation of leaders who will go out and launch daughter churches.
Wow. So it's about building that multiplication engine right within the church itself. That leads us naturally to the final phase, phase 5, reproducing.
This is the planter's joy, as the source puts it, like becoming a grandparent, they say. The church plant has successfully reproduced itself by planting another church. That's the defining mark. This phase involves strengthening and sending.
And reproduction isn't just planting like a carbon copy next door, is it?
No, not at all. It's broader than that. It's about the church itself becoming a missionary sending agent. Not just planting locally, but potentially sending people to distant, unreached groups, fulfilling that bigger apostolic mandate. Cooperation and partnership with other like-minded churches in the region also becomes important here.
And the original apostolic planters who started that first church, what's their role now that the church is reproducing on its own?
Well, they might remain for a time, perhaps as multipliers or coaches, offering guidance and encouragement to the new generation of leaders and the new church plants. But ultimately, their role is to move on, to pioneer new places where the gospel isn't known. So in relation to that specific church they started, they become, in essence, a memory.
Wow. Motor, to model, to mobilizer and mentor, to multiplier, and finally to memory.
Yeah.
That's a really profound shift in the leadership role across those 5 phases.
It truly is. And that whole leadership transition, it really embodies the core principle that the source says binds all of this together, which is equipping and shared responsibility. It actually calls this the method behind the methods.
Equipping others from the very earliest phases so they can assume responsibility. It's not just what you do, but how you do it, always with an eye on empowering others.
Exactly. The source is very firm on this. Planters have to resist the temptation to push ministries ahead faster than local people are ready or willing to lead them. After that initial launch phase, where the planter might be the motor, ideally, any new ministry that starts up should be led, or at least co-led, by a local believer who is actively being equipped for that role.
So the planter isn't indispensable to any one particular ministry. That ensures that if or when they eventually withdraw, things don't just fall apart. That really builds an ethos of equipping and multiplication right into the fabric, the culture of the church from early on.
Precisely. And this whole journey raises an important question about the people involved, and specifically the gifts needed. The source highlights that different critical spiritual gifts are particularly prominent, particularly necessary at different phases.
Right, like certain strengths or abilities are more vital depending on which phase you're currently navigating.
Yes, exactly. For example, evangelism and apostleship. That pioneering, going out gift are absolutely critical for the initial work of launching. But as you move into establishing and new believers need nurture, teaching, and equipping, then pastoral and teaching gifts become really key. Then administration becomes more important for structuring. As the organization grows, resources need managing, things get more complex.
And then when you hit reproducing,
Yeah.
what gifts are needed then?
Well, apostolic and evangelistic gifts become essential again, but the source stresses something important here. Ideally, these should be operating through local believers. They are the next generation of planters being sent out. And the source gives a really crucial warning here for planters. Don't let the church get stuck at a certain phase just because it happens to perfectly align with your own personal giftings. For instance, a planter who is a fantastic mooder in the launching phase might actually be a poor mentor needed for establishing. If they don't transition their role effectively and, crucially, mobilize local people with the right gifts for the current phase, the church can just stall out. Identifying and mobilizing those local gifts is absolutely critical for forward movement.
That makes so much sense.
Mhm.
You really need the right mix of gifting and the right leadership style to navigate each stage of growth effectively.
And finally, the source gives one last, really crucial warning. It's about avoiding sequential thinking.
Wait, but we just spent all this time talking about 5 distinct phases.
Mhm.
Are you saying we shouldn't think of them as, like, strictly sequential steps,
Yeah.
one after the other?
That's exactly what the source is warning against, yes. Thinking of them as purely linear steps, where you have to fully complete one before you even start thinking about the next, is actually problematic. Reproduction and multiplication, the source argues pretty strongly, should be built into each phase, not just left until the very end, phase 5.
Okay, how do you actually do that? Build multiplication in right from the start.
By instilling that ethos, that mindset, really early on. So as new believers are one in the launching phase, they aren't just discipled in doctrine. They're immediately taught and encouraged to evangelize and disciple others. As they gather in small groups in the establishing phase, they learn how to lead those groups and how to train others to lead. The idea isn't to wait until the church is perfectly mature or has every possible ministry before you even think about reproduction. Instead, you make multiplication part of the church's DNA, its normal way of operating, throughout its entire ministry life cycle.
So ministry becomes cumulative, building on itself, rather than strictly sequential, step by step.
Precisely. Just because you move from launching into establishing doesn't mean you suddenly stop evangelizing. Of course not. Just because you're working on structuring doesn't mean you stop multiplying small groups and raising up new leaders. That continues. A church doesn't need to have every single ministry perfectly in place or be considered fully developed before it can plant another church. If that multiplication ethos is instilled early and consistently, reproduction becomes a natural, ongoing outcome, not some monumental task you only attempt way down the line.
So wrapping this up, what does this all really mean for us? We've taken a deep dive into this source material. We've seen that developing an initiative like a church plant, well, it isn't just random. It seems to follow these discernible patterns, moving through these phases, preparing, launching, establishing, structuring, and reproducing.
And we've seen how critically important it is for the leadership role to adapt, shifting dramatically across these phases. Moving from being those initial drivers and learners to being behind-the-scenes mobilizers and mentors, and ultimately becoming multipliers who intentionally phase themselves out. That whole journey from motor to memory.
Right. And underlying it all, it seems the real magic, the method behind the methods, as the source calls it, it lies in this deep commitment to equipping others right from the very beginning and weaving multiplication into the very fabric of the effort, ensuring that growth isn't just linear addition, but becomes a cumulative, reproducing force.
Which definitely leads to a pretty significant question for all of us, I think.
Yeah. So here's a provocative thought for you to consider as we finish up. If successful long-term development and multiplication, maybe regardless of the specific context, whether it's a church, a business, a community project, if it depends so heavily on intentionally equipping others early on and resisting that powerful urge to just do everything yourself, What does that imply about the leadership models and the strategies we use in any kind of growing organization, movement, or even just a team? What are you equipping others for starting today?